It's nice to be at the City Club, important Cleveland institution, devoted to free speech, and an institution that Judge William K. Thomas, whom the inn is named after, was actively involved in. This year's program is going to deal with issues of evidence, admitting, excluding, tactical decisions, recent developments in the law. But we wanted tonight, for the first meeting, to use it as an opportunity to commemorate Judge Thomas, whom the inn is named after, and whom in many ways personified the values of the inn. And we're fortunate enough to have tonight a number of people who knew Judge Thomas well. Judge Thomas's son, who's an esteemed member of the inn, is here, but also people who worked with him, clerked for him, appeared before him, and the City Club has been kind enough to videotape tonight's presentation, and Avery Friedman assures me that he'll get it played in its entirety on CNN. So it's my privilege to turn the program over to Nora Hurley, who organized tonight's program, who clerked for Judge Thomas for many years. I ask you to turn off your cell phones if you don't have them on vibrate. We wouldn't want the CNN audience to be hearing cell phones going off during our presentation. Nora?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This evening is dedicated to the Honorable William K. Thomas, in whose name we meet each and every month, and who this Inn of Court is dedicated. For many of our members, old and new, you never had a chance to meet Judge William K. Thomas, and we have a number of presenters here this evening who wish to share with you the stories of the man that wore the robe, the man that was known for his professionalism and his integrity. Our first presenter this evening is the Honorable Dan Aaron Polster, Judge, United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. Please.
Thanks very much, Nora, and I apologize to the old members and the new members for dashing in and out. Obviously, I've been a little occupied during the day, and as a result, I've had to jam in my interviews for law clerks last night, tonight, and tomorrow night. So I got a couple bright young people who are eager to be interviewed. So, and I appreciate being put first on the program. And although judges, it's dangerous to give a judge a microphone. You never know what you're going to get or how long he or she's going to take. I will very much be brief. I actually never had the privilege of trying a case before Judge Thomas. And I think, you know, both when I was a lawyer and now when I'm a judge, that's when you really get to know people. When you're trying a case, whether you're a judge in front of a lawyer or now it's the other way around. I guess we see each other at the best and the worst, some high-pressure moments, some funny moments, some high-stress moments. You know, that's sort of the pinnacle of advocacy, both for the lawyer and the judge. And I'm sorry I never had that privilege. Just didn't work out. And I think I probably actually got to know Judge Thomas the best starting in the summer of '98 when I came on the bench and he stepped down. And I'll start by saying I fortunately never had to buy a robe because I was given the robes by two extraordinary jurists when I came on, Judge Sam Bell and Judge Thomas. And I'll get to Judge Thomas's robe, the story, because it illustrates what I'm trying to say. And so when I get on the bench, I put that robe on, I am really reminded of how I'm supposed to act. It's a big deal, not just to go out there, but I'm wearing the robe, whichever one I put on that day, of a very extraordinary jurist, and I try to sort of live up to the way they practiced and they appeared on the bench. I always tell people that to be a good judge, you need three things. You need something up here, you need something here, and you need something below the belt. And Judge Thomas had all three. He obviously had a very keen intellect, and Although he could be quiet, soft-spoken, he was a man of steel. But I'm just going to maybe talk about a couple things about the heart, because he really had that. How I got this robe. This robe was almost new when I got it, and you may wonder how a federal judge who's been on the bench for 30 years could have a brand new robe. Well, this is why. His clerks came up to him and said, you know, Judge, your robe is pretty threadbare. I mean, you really, you know, you need something new. I mean, it doesn't, you know, you're a federal judge. And he said, this was Judge Green's robe. He gave it to me. It was good enough for him. It's good enough for me. End of discussion. Except his law clerks, I guess Nora was very persuasive. She said, all right, Judge, at least when there's a ceremony, will you wear this? So he had this nice robe, and I think he only wore it maybe for investitures and picture taking. But again, that showed what kind of person he was. That robe, it wasn't just a robe. It was a robe of a jurist who you really respected, and that's what he was going to wear. And it didn't matter if it was a little threadbare. He didn't care. If someone said, what's, you know, distinguished judge, his robe's threadbare, what's wrong with him? He didn't care at all because he knew why he was wearing it. He often told me, I don't know how many people he told, that it was sort of fortuitous he got on the federal bench, and he was willing to tell this story. He said, look, I wasn't anyone's first choice. There were two senators. They both had someone else on the list. I was the number two. So they deadlocked, and they defaulted to me. All right, and he said, you know, probably all of us could say something like that. There's a lot of luck and accident, and you know, we're never better than anyone else. But he told it, you know, he was very, very honest about it, and it showed that, you know, here's a guy who became an extraordinary jurist for 30 years, and it was sort of an accident. But he figured he got a break, and he made the most of it. And lastly, Judge Thomas was always cognizant that the matters before him were not just cases. I mean, there was people, there were institutions, there was a human dimension. He knew what the impact was going to be. And I think that's why he took so much time sometimes to make a decision. It wasn't just he wanted to get it right according to the Sixth Circuit or the Supreme Court, but he wanted to make sure that it sat right for the lawyers and the litigants. And, you know, at the end of the day, and maybe as I'm getting older I appreciate this more, none of us are remembered very long for what we accomplish or how much money we make or brilliant opinions we write or any of that crap. If we're lucky, we're remembered for how we treated people. Well, first our family, of course, and Steve will talk about that. Then our friends and those people we interact with professionally. And I think that's Judge Thomas's greatest legacy, and it's quite frankly why we named the inn after him and why we're all proud to be part of the William K. Thomas Inn of Court. So with that, I thank you, and I'm sorry I'm going to miss some extraordinary remarks from my colleagues. Happily, they're being taped, so I'll be able to watch it. And I promise the next couple meetings I'll be able to stick all the way through.
Thank you, Judge Polster. I am Nora Hurley, and I had the honor and the extreme privilege to be Judge Thomas's law clerk for the last 5 years before he retired. And tonight I'm going to share a story that was shared with me 20 years ago, the night before I interviewed with Judge William K. Thomas. I was sitting in the living room of my father-in-law, Roger Hurley, and he was asking me about my interview tomorrow and asked me, what do I know about Judge Thomas? I began immediately to recite the facts of his appointment and all the judicial facts, and he said, no, that's not what I meant, Nora. What do you know about the man, Judge William K. Thomas? And I must have had the same puzzled look that I just expressed now, because my father-in-law then proceeded to say, well, let me tell you a story. Have you ever heard of the story of Fast Eddie Watkins? He's a notorious bank robber, perhaps Cleveland's most notorious bank robber, dating back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was known for robbing 55 banks, more than $1.5 million. Fast Eddie Watkins was known for robbing banks quickly, getting away, but never harming anyone. But eventually, he got caught and was tried, and the trial judge was Judge William K. Thomas. Knowing Judge Thomas was had a reputation of being a very fair judge, Eddie Watkins had no idea how fair. At the conclusion of his trial, despite being found guilty, Eddie Watkins looked to Judge Thomas in all sincerity and thanked him for the fairest trial any defendant could have ever hoped for. And with all sincerity, even after sentencing and being sent to federal prison, Eddie Watkins thanked Judge Thomas, acknowledged that he deserved his sentence, knew it was fair, and announced that he wouldn't be filing any appeals. Nor did he. Well, Fast Eddie Watkins was serving his sentence, but not for very long. He managed to escape from prison. Not knowing what else to do, he returned to the only thing he did know, robbing banks. And lo and behold, he's robbing a bank in Cleveland, and only one thing was different this time. Fast Eddie Watkins had a heart condition, and he forgot his heart pills, and he panicked, and he took hostages. Changed everything. This time, FBI, police, hostage negotiators are on the scene, and they all want to speak to Eddie, and he's refusing, and announces that he will only speak to Judge William K. Thomas. Off the FBI agents go to the federal courthouse. Judge Thomas is on the bench in the middle of a proceeding, and the FBI agents interrupt and whisk him away. On the phone, Eddie Watkins, speaking to Judge Thomas, apologizes for his acts, apologizes for taking the hostages, and explains, "Judge, I asked for you because I knew I could trust you, and I knew you wouldn't try anything funny. I asked for you because I need something. I need you to get my pills. I left them in the glove box of my getaway car. It's located here, but I could only trust you, Judge. I promise I will let go the hostages. I'll surrender, but you got to do this for me, Judge. Do I have your word?" "You have my word," was Judge Thomas's reply. He did just that. He personally went and retrieved the pills from the glove box, and he delivered them to Fast Eddie Watkins. Despite the FBI's intentions to intervene and scheme a plan where they were going to replace the pills, Judge Thomas would hear nothing of it, refused them, and said, "I gave the man my word." So Judge Thomas followed through, gave Fast Eddie his pills, and Fast Eddie followed through with his promise. He released the hostages, and he surrendered. Criminal or not, he was a man of his word. By the time Roger was done telling me this story, I was in awe. I couldn't wait to meet Judge Thomas the next day for my interview. I went promptly 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning to my interview, but at the end of the interview, I couldn't resist, and I just told Judge Thomas and shared with him the same story I just shared with you, and explained that my father-in-law just told this to me. And at the end of him telling that to me, I knew that I so wanted to meet and work for a man such as yourself. Judge Thomas gave me the opportunity to work for him, and it was the most incredible privilege and honor. And what a teacher he was. Nothing that any school books, classroom, nothing could ever compare. But my Fast Eddie Watkins story has another saga. It doesn't end there. Fast Eddie Watkins is now back in prison, and he starts to write letters, and he writes letters to Judge Thomas, almost weekly. Judge Thomas even writes back, and also Fast Eddie Watkins starts taking up the hobby of painting. And he paints a painting for Judge Thomas, and he sends it to him, gifts it to him in gratitude. For those of you who knew Judge Thomas, you knew that he never accepted gifts. Not for himself, not for his chambers, not for his staff. It was improper, inappropriate. He wouldn't even accept lunch from attorneys if they offered to buy him lunch. So instead of returning the artwork to the federal penitentiary, Judge Thomas wrote a check, and he paid Fast Eddie Watkins for his artwork. He wrote in his letter, "Use the money to buy your art supplies." Well, this relationship continued throughout the years, the letter writing, the paintings, so forth. As a law clerk, I would wait for the Fast Eddie Watkins letters to arrive when we'd all be reading them just because of the notoriety. But years flew by, and now it's 1998, and Judge Thomas officially announces that he's retiring from the bench. There was an article in the paper, and Fast Eddie Watkins also saw that article in the paper. Judge Thomas received a letter, a final letter from Fast Eddie, and this one was a little different. It had a special request. Eddie Watkins was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he was going to die in prison. He said, "Judge, I know I deserve to be here, and I never filed an appeal, but I just don't want to die in prison. Can you help me? Can you write to the parole authority, ask for my release?" As much as Judge Thomas wanted to, he was in the midst of clearing out his chambers. He was packing up, and he announced, he said, "I'm retiring, I'm old, I no longer have any influence." And I wanted to say, this is Fast Eddie Watkins, Judge. You have influence. And I convinced him to allow me to take a stab to draft that letter. And I did, and he signed it and sent it. And a few weeks later, we got notice from the federal penitentiary that they were releasing Fast Eddie Watkins. The story has one more ending. A few days later, Fast Eddie Watkins calls Judge Thomas's chambers in this old, decrepit, crackly voice who can barely speak in between his oxygen. He says, "I wondered if the judge would humble me and visit with me if I came downtown to see him one last time." I told Judge Thomas this, and he didn't even react. His emotions were just, his face was just the way it always is. And he said, "Of course." And we set up the time. I opened up the chamber's doors. Here's Fast Eddie Watkins, the notorious bank robber. He's hunched over in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes through his nose. I let him into Judge Thomas's chambers, closed the door, and there they sat and talked for more than an hour and a half. Who knows about what? He never told, not Judge Thomas. He would never divulge. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the man that is Judge William K. Thomas. And I ask you to indulge the rest of us, have us tell you about the man in whose name we meet each and every month. Thank you. The next speaker, I introduce Avery Friedman.
Every day I see Judge Thomas, actually twice a day. His picture hangs in the anteroom outside of the lobby right before you walk into my office. We had about 60 cases, give or take, in his magnificent courtroom, all civil rights cases, and he always seemed to rule the right way, even when we lost. I miss him today and think of him every day. William K. Thomas looked for the truth in a manner that was always kind and always courteous. But conventionality in getting there was of no importance to Judge Thomas. In Cuyahoga County, March 17th is generally treated by all judges as kind of a holy day. Not with Judge Thomas. He set a hearing on March 17th, and we were there until 7 o'clock at night. Christmas Eve, we were in his courtroom. Once we were in the midst of a one-month trial against a bank, and I saw one of the lawyers, a very heavy fellow, starting to tilt. I mean, he was tilting. And I'm thinking to myself, I think he's going down. And indeed, the guy fainted, and it was like one of these, kaboom, boom, face down in Judge Thomas's courtroom. Judge Thomas had this guy was about 350 pounds. So Judge Thomas had the five of us pick him up and bring him into his chambers. And I have to tell you, if you've never picked up 350 pounds of dead weight, I mean, it's heavy. Anyway, so we pick the guy up and we bring him into chambers, and you'd think that Judge Thomas will call EMS or court security or something like that, but this is so Judge Thomas. He's like holding his hand, patting his hand. "Mr. So-and-so, are you all right?" It was like out of a movie. "Mr. So-and-so, are you all right?" It was so gentle. Anyway, the guy wakes up and comes out of his coma or whatever, and Judge Thomas asks if he's okay, and the guy's still glassy-eyed, but he says, yeah. So the judge orders everybody back in the courtroom to trial. It was unbelievable. But to me, the most important case started in January and ended every day, ended in July. We had a 7-month trial, which was preceded by 63 depositions. And I represented this nonprofit organization, and on the other side was like the largest real estate company in Ohio at the time. So, and there are 9 lawyers on the other side, too. And it struck me that everybody in the courtroom was getting paid on an hourly basis or salary except me, which, of course, meant nothing to Judge Thomas. He just wanted the case tried. So I spent 7 months in that courtroom. Actually, my best friend was the vice president at National City Bank who kept giving me bridge loans. But every day, 9 to 4, sometimes longer. And I watched this man every day. And despite the frailties of those of us who practice, our imperfection, he showed us so much tolerance. And if he was stuck on an issue, he suspended court, went back into chambers with his clerks, and they would come back with his ruling every day. More than that, I saw the transformation. He could make a lousy lawyer, well, less lousy, I guess, because they try to elevate themselves in his presence. That which this end stands for, our professionalism, the advancement of our ethical obligations, is what this man was, all done with kindness. Judge Thomas made okay lawyers better because they wanted to emulate his exactitude and his demeanor and his exactitude in getting things right. He helped good lawyers become great lawyers. And he made some great lawyers, legendary lawyers. Some of them are here tonight. At Blossom Time in Chagrin Falls, there's a parade that goes on every year. And back when I was a young lawyer, I took my young family and I situated them on the tree lawn in front of Judge Thomas's house, watched the parade. And there was Judge Thomas sitting in a rocking chair on his porch. And I'm sitting on his tree lawn. And somehow, I'm thinking, somehow, maybe by osmosis or something, that the kindness and thoughtfulness of this great judge would somehow go through the rocking chair into the ground and up me in some way, but maybe to make me better, but it didn't work. By the way, at the end of the 7-month trial, Judge Thomas granted my client what we asked for, $1, and of course the statutory legal fees that went with that. I took my students from the law school over to watch the closing argument that the very wonderful, bombastic Jerry Milano was making. He was representing a big-shot real estate guy, Carl Milstein, who had been charged with bribing Charlie Lucas, who was a high-level federal official. So Jerry tells the jury that no matter what they do, they should know that the case had been tried in the courtroom of, quote, the finest federal judge in America. Then he sits down. So there's this like stunned silence in the courtroom, and everyone's looking at Judge Thomas. You could see he was thinking, and he looks up and says, having heard no objection to the last statement, there's nothing for me to overrule.
hear from John Larson, I'm sorry.
Good evening, folks. I want to start by telling you that at the table tonight, we talked about one thing that was the most fitting thing for William K. Thomas. That was his courtroom in the old Federal Building. Anybody that's a member of this court that's never seen it, we ought to have a tour one night and go there and just see it. It's not only is it unbelievable with all the artwork and the gold, and it's eloquent, but Judge Thomas's personality fit into that court, or the court fit into him so much that I could never imagine any other judge being in that court. That's the kind of a judge he was. I had the opportunity to know Judge Thomas before he became a lawyer because I went to college with his son, Steve. The rumors that we were part of some hippie commune in Vermont are grossly exaggerated. But then when the 70s came, we started practicing law. Terry Gilbert and I got involved with the Kent State May 4th families and represented them in hundreds of arrests and whatever, and Bill Kunstler came in, and we did the gymnasium case. I don't know if you know what that is, but there was going to be an annex built on at Kent that would infringe on Blanket Hill, and all the parents of the 4 kids that were killed and the wounded students who survived were fighting it. We took it to the Sixth Circuit, and we lost on the very same day that the civil case got remanded back, and it got remanded back to Judge William K. Thomas. So the ACLU had won the appeal, and they were representing the families, and some of the clients came to me and says, you know what, ACLU, we trust you guys, the National Lawyers Guild, we want you to be a part of this. And besides this judge we got, this William K. Thomas, back in 1971, he wouldn't throw out the indictments against the Kent 25. If you don't know the history, back after the National Guard shot 13 students, including killing 4, 25 students got indicted for aggravated riot from the Portage County grand jury. And actually, Judge Thomas did have the case. It was called Hammond versus Brown. Billy Joe Brown, I think, was the Attorney General. And Judge Thomas, I said to the clients, you don't understand. Well, he said, no, he wouldn't throw out all the indictments. But what he did do was pretty unbelievable. The Portage County grand jury issued a 100-plus page report about the activities on May 4th, 1970 in Kent. We all that practice criminal law know that's not what grand juries do. They don't issue reports, they indict people, or they no-bill people. And it was a pretty extreme thing for a grand jury to take a position on a historic event. And actually, Judge Thomas ordered that the grand jury report be burned in public by Lucy DeLeon, who was the clerk of courts in Portage County at the time. So when the retrial started, I sat down with the clients. I said, this is the judge we want. I mean, and he was incredible. I remember the early rulings. It was really the first time I had been in front of him. I'd seen him with Steve and had lunch with him, but he would never let me buy him lunch either. But every time he made a ruling, and I was a young lawyer, you know the cowboys that have the Derringer up their sleeve and all of a sudden it's in his hand? That's the way Judge Thomas was with the federal rule book. I thought it was under his robe, and every time he did it, he got to the right page. He was that kind of a judge. So this is the Kent State case. It's got the whole country watching it, and this is the only judge, I think, in the country that could have settled this case. You got really angry plaintiffs. 4 of the sets of parents lost their kids, including Arthur Krause from Pennsylvania, whose daughter Allison was murdered down at Kent. Here's what Judge Thomas did on a Sunday. He got all of the guard down there in one room, and he got all of the plaintiffs and the families in the other room. And he spent, I don't know how many hours with the plaintiffs, and one by one with his robes on in his court, he went to each of the plaintiffs and says, I need to see your injury. I mean, this is a federal judge, and he's on the ground looking at Tom Grace's foot to see what the archway looks like because of the bullets. And he developed such a level of respect I think, from both sides. And Arthur Kraus didn't want to settle. He didn't want to put his daughter to rest. He wanted one more crack at Governor James Rhodes. And they wanted an apology. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, and there were meetings with Reverend John Adams, who was sort of the spokesperson for the Methodist Church for the families. The judge comes back to us and says, they're not going to apologize. Can you live with a statement of regret? I mean, he came down in the middle somewhere, and he came down in a way that got everybody's attention. And he settled the case. It's just an incredible display of somebody that weaved through things and never angered anybody and got everything from every side and somehow figured out how to settle it. So then, and part of it, I just want to tell you that he got every attorney that had ever been involved with that case to come down to a hearing. There were like 35 or 40 attorneys. You know, Ben Shearer and Nelson Carl and Dave Engdahl and some of the ones from the first trials. And he got every single lawyer, except for one, to waive their right to any fees to settle the case. The one attorney that wouldn't do it, somebody named Sindel, challenged it, and then Judge Thomas did even the more brilliant thing. There was $50,000 allocated for attorney fees, and he designated $33,000 of it to the law firm, and made the law firm fight it out and settle the case. So that's just one piece of Judge Thomas I wanted to share with you. But I do want to tell you one other minor little thing. In the middle of the Kent case, I run into him one. I think, did he take the Rapid? I ran into him in front of the terminal tower, and he's got a newspaper in his hand. And I said, "Hi, Judge Thomas." He says, "Hi, John. What's in the paper?" He says, "Well, I just found this dead bird on the sidewalk, and it's some rare bird that nobody's ever seen in downtown Cleveland." And he found it and took it to the federal court. And that's the kind of guy he was. He was you know, it made a big impression on me as a young lawyer. So that's my small bit on Judge William K. Thomas, and we should all be really honored that we're part of a group that has his name. Thanks.
Mr. Neil Raines?
I've heard a lot about Judge Thomas, but I have never heard that he was one for the birds, John. You have plowed new ground, but as many of you, or some of you may know, and certainly none of you would be surprised, Judge Thomas was a very skillful and successful trial lawyer before he became a trial judge, and he was, in fact, I believe, a partner of Craig Spangenberg, whose name lives on in a very fine law firm here in Cleveland still today. But whenever I talk about, or whenever I think about Judge Thomas, I guess the thing that first comes to my mind is when I saw his skills as a trial lawyer while sitting on the witness stand in his courtroom. And I was cross-examined by the judge. At the time, I was in the middle of an antitrust trial before Judge Krensler. And a motion to disqualify my law firm from some litigation had been filed, and Judge Thomas was going to have a hearing on that, and I told some of my co-counsel in the antitrust case that I might be interrupted, and sure enough, at noon, I was told, "You have to go down to Judge Thomas's courtroom." One of my co-counsel offered to come down and cross-examine me. This was the same lawyer who had threatened to cross-examine our own expert if he didn't like the direct exam. So I thought it was prudent to decline that offer on his part. So I went down, and Stan Fisher, whom some of you may know, and Stan is very famous as Lee Fisher's father. Stan was a lawyer who had just joined Arter and Haddon, where I was practicing at the time. And because Stan and I had been on opposite sides of a case, and my client had settled out of it, the parties in the case were concerned that there'd be some contamination, that information would flow between Stan and myself, and so they had filed this motion to disqualify. And those of you who may have known Stan will recall that Stan was a loquacious fellow. And Stan is at his loquacious best in doing the direct examination of me. And he's kind of wandering around a little bit, and, you know, he's not really quite getting to the point. But Judge Thomas, always a gentleman, said, excuse me, Mr. Fisher, let me ask Mr. Raines a few questions. And, you know, there you could see that this is a guy who knew his way around a courtroom, and not just from the bench. He asked me about 6 questions, said, well, I've heard enough. The motion is denied. Mr. Raines, you're needed upstairs. You better get back up there. And that was the end of that. Now, as I was listening to Nora's tale about Fast Eddie Watkins, and I never met Fast Eddie, probably good, but I remember reading a lot about him. But I was thinking to myself, although 2 different professions, 2 very consummate professional men dealing with each other, because that is the other thing I think I would always come to my mind in talking about Judge Thomas. He was a professional. You know, he was a slightly built man, his silver hair combed back, glasses, very trim. He didn't ever raise his voice, at least that I ever saw, but that man commanded more respect, I think, in a courtroom simply because of his demeanor and the politeness or the professionalism with which he dealt with lawyers in front of him. He didn't need to raise his voice because everybody knew he was an excellent judge. Everybody liked and respected him. And, you know, he is a fellow that if you ever had the pleasure of appearing in front of him, you would think, boy, I wish I could be a lawyer or a judge like that gentleman.
Next, we have Mr. Nicky Schwartz.
There are many benefits to growing older, trust me. There are some detriments, however, and one of them is with each passing year, there are fewer and fewer lawyers with whom I can discuss Judge William K. Thomas. And so when offered the opportunity to come here tonight to talk about him, I jumped at it. It's an honor and a privilege. You probably haven't noticed that I haven't been here much. It's not that I love you all the less, it's that I love my wife the more. But the opportunity to come here to talk about and hear about Judge Thomas was irresistible. I'll start with my favorite anecdote, so in case I run out of time, I don't miss it. And that involved the Cleveland police discrimination case, in which the Shield Club, an organization of black Cleveland police officers, sued the city, alleging racial discrimination in hiring, promotion, etc. And the Fraternal Order of Police intervened as a defendant to defend the status quo. And I, thanks to Jerry Gold, found myself representing the FOP in this action. It lasted for almost 20 years. There was a decree that governed things for many years, and so periodically there would be hearings over the course of this 20 years, and with casts of thousands at every one of them, because you had all these lawyers and all these parties and so on. And I'm sitting in my office at 9:20 in the morning, and I get a call from someone from Judge Thomas's chambers. Where are you? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there was a hearing scheduled for today, 9 o'clock. I said, oh, my God. And so I rushed over, and I arrived there, and I did not receive a tongue lashing, not even a gentle reprimand. Instead, what happened was they had started the hearing and got 20 minutes into it before they realized that I wasn't there. And so what I got instead was Judge Thomas said, well, Nicky, I know you've missed the first 20 minutes of these proceedings, and I want you to be fully aware of what has gone on. So I'm going to ask the court reporter to read you the transcript of the first 20 minutes, while all these people are sitting there in court. I said, no, Judge, that won't be necessary. He said, I insist. And so sitting there for those 20 minutes was much more chastising than any kind of reprimand could have been. Consideration of William K. Thomas requires, of course, brings you to consider what are the criteria for evaluating judges and what makes for good judges or great judges. And I have my list, and I'm not going to spend the time. I think we all know what makes for a good judge. And he was at the top, near or at the top of every category that you would use to evaluate a judge, with one exception, and that was judicial temperament. And on judicial temperament, he was off the chart. I get choked up just thinking about it. I've spent many years on the Judicial Selection Committee of the Bar Association, and I confess to having a roaring bias, and that is that I believe that judicial temperament is the sine qua non of being a good, even an adequate judge. That if you have judicial temperament, you can be a good judge even though you have deficiencies in all other categories. And if you are a superstar in every other category but don't have judicial temperament, you're unqualified as far as I'm concerned, and that's the way I vote. And so that's what impressed me so about Judge William K. Thomas. And so what took him from excellence to greatness? And there are two things in my mind that made him great, beyond great. One was that he was humbled by his power rather than emboldened by it. He recognized that life had given him power, godlike power, over the lives of other human beings, but had not given him godlike wisdom. And it made him humble in the exercise of that power. Number two, he understood better than any judge I've ever appeared before how important it is for the loser to walk out feeling that they'd had a fair day in court. He had infinite patience, and he would entertain infinite motions for reconsideration. And not just on a you can make me sit here while you talk basis, but really would listen. And just because you won the first 3 times didn't mean you were going to win the 4th time on the reconsideration, because he would listen and he would change his mind. And it could be infuriating if you won the first 3 times and you were focused on getting a result and in doing so efficiently, but he wanted to do it the right way and get there the right way. And on the other hand, when the merits were clear, he could get there quickly. The shortest case I ever had was the case of O Calcutta. The Broadway Productions had rented a music hall to produce the Broadway show O Calcutta, which was notorious for having frontal nudity. Mayor Perk, in his 1977 election campaign, decided that he would rescind the contract allowing O Calcutta to be performed at the music hall, and I was representing Broadway Productions. And from the filing of the complaint to the rendition of final judgment was 24 hours. And O Calcutta played in Cleveland. The best example, if you're really interested in understanding Judge Thomas and reading not just about him, but his product, I recommend you read the case of Hammond versus Brown, which John Lawson alluded to. It was the case in which the 24 students and 1 faculty member who had been indicted by the Portage County grand jury sought to enjoin the prosecutions on the ground that, and the only ground that they could have succeeded on under present Supreme Court authority at the time, was to prove that the prosecutions were brought in bad faith for the purpose of chilling the First Amendment expression without any meaningful hope of success. And the plaintiffs were prepared to prove what happened on May 4th in order to demonstrate there was no hope of success. So Judge Thomas was offered the opportunity to essentially adjudicate what happened on May 4th before any other courts did. his judicial restraint, in the best sense of the word, not in the way it's used today politically to call those judges you don't like activists and those who you do like having judicial restraint. His judicial restraint caused him not to say, I'm not here as a judge to adjudicate what happened on May 4 or to second-guess the grand jury, and he ultimately denied the motion. On the other hand, the grand jury report, which had been issued, in effect purported to find these people guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what he ordered, not just expunged, but physically destroyed with a ceremonial burning in downtown Ravenna. And it's a very creative result. And at the time, I thought, well, big deal. But it made a difference. And I think it really is what one of the things that contributed to those prosecutions going nowhere and ultimately being dismissed. As a result of this and my incredible regard for Judge Thomas, well, again, read that report because it shows his judicial restraint, his brilliance, his compassion, his creativity. Read Hammond versus Brown, 323 F. Sup. 326. But in any event, as a result of my extent to which I revered Judge Thomas, two of my proudest accomplishments are, one, having been his invitee to the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference, and two, having been the 2004 recipient of the Cleveland Bar Association's William K. Thomas Professionalism Award. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Steve Thomas, Judge Thomas's son.
Having never practiced law in front of my father, other than dinner table conversations, my stories won't be about his legal accomplishments, although I could embellish on many of the things you've heard this evening from those conversations. When someone dies, you lose the opportunity to ask questions. What about Uncle Bob? What about Grandpa Reen? Or whatever. One thing I know is if asked what he thinks about tonight's venerations, my father would say, I'd rather not. My dad was born in 1911. He was the middle of three sons. His parents were Maureen Ross Thomas and Gail Kernahan Thomas. The Thomas family has roots in Champaign County, Ohio, where it moved to accept land grants from Revolutionary War service. The most notable member of the family was Marion Ross, one of 8 Ohio Civil War soldiers, who was posthumously awarded the nation's first Congressional Medal of Honor for participating in the Andrews Raiders' raid on Confederate railways. My father's mother's father was an Irish bound boy, an indentured servant who ran away from his Ohio master in the Civil War to join the Union Army. My father's father was a newspaper advertising manager, for Columbus, Ohio newspapers, who lost his job in the Great Depression. The Great Depression molded much of my father's experience. Bill Thomas, and out of the courtroom he always referred to himself as Bill, was a student at Ohio State, undergraduate, at the time that his father lost his job. He was an editor of the Macchio, which is the annual yearbook at Ohio State for those of you who went there. And his salary as editor supported the family until his father found employment. As a student at Ohio State Law School, where my dad founded the Ohio State Law Journal, he took an interest in labor law. One summer, he sought to organize the workers at a local grocery store. Those were pre-Wagner Act times, and all of the people who signed the cards were fired. My dad spent the rest of that summer finding employment for each of those persons who lost, who lost their jobs because he encouraged them to organize. In 1936, he became an associate with Marvin Harrison. The firm at the time was Harrison and Marshman. He became a partner eventually. He hired Craig Spangenberg. And after World War II, the family moved to Geauga County in 1946. My dad was appointed, if you've read the materials that were provided, you may know some of this. My dad was appointed in 1951 to the Geauga County bench by Frank Lausche to close the notorious Pettibone Gambling Club. In 1953, he found out that he couldn't support his family and plan for his children's college educations on the $5,000 salary he was making as a Geauga County jurist. He'd been making a salary or wages of $50,000 as a lawyer before he became a judge, which in those days was good money. So my dad contacted Governor Lausche and he said, Governor, there's an opening in Cuyahoga County. I'd love to get the appointment. We moved about half a mile from Geauga County and Chagrin Falls to Cuyahoga County, and my dad was appointed. One of the facts of my dad's life is that he was very loyal to his children. There's a story in the materials about him helping deliver Sunday newspapers for me when I was laid up because of frostbite. He also would help my oldest brother, John, deliver Sunday newspapers, and one of the customers on the car route was Senator George Bender, a Republican who was in Chagrin Falls. George Bender figured out that a Democratic Common Pleas judge was delivering his newspaper, and he would go down to the front of his long driveway every Sunday to accept the paper from the judge with a smile on his face. In 1956, my dad and Sammy Silbert decided that they would challenge the system that was used at that time of partisan general elections for judges. Not only did you run in a partisan primary, but in the general election you ran as a Democrat or as a Republican. They chose to run as independents. Ray Miller was the Cuyahoga County Democratic boss at the time, and he decided he would teach these guys a lesson. Sam Silbert was a legend. He had no problem winning. My dad was a relatively recent jurist in Cuyahoga County, and even though it was a Friday night before the general election, when Sammy was trying to drag him to go to political rallies, my dad instead went to the high school football games where his sons, my older brothers, were playing at the time. As was alluded to by Judge Polster, when my dad was appointed to the federal bench, it was because he was the second choice of both Frank Lausche and Steve Young, then the senators. They each said, Bill, you're not my first choice, my second choice. They couldn't agree on the first choices, and so my dad got it by default. I was interested to hear Judge Polster's comment that the robe that my dad wore was from Ben Green, because Ben was the second judge appointed in the Kennedy administration. My dad was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. And the first was Frank Battisti. After Ben got the appointment, and Ben had been the chairman of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, he had no real legal experience before he became a judge. Excuse me, we were concerned that that meant opportunities had been lost. But, so this opportunity came, and what do you know, I find out tonight that he was honored to wear Ben Green's robe. In the community, my dad was a organizer and perhaps the only member of the Save Our Bus Committee, which maintained local bus service before RTA came to Chagrin Falls. And he took the bus religiously. He called himself the head SOB in the village. One year, the bus line, which was variously run by a group out of Youngstown and also by a group called the Brothers in Christ, couldn't make their payroll, and my dad gave $600 to the head of the company so that they could make payroll. I'm sure it was because it was cheaper than to buy a second car. I never saw my dad pull rank on anybody except when we were driving back from my college graduation in 1969. I was driving my 1962 Ford Fairlane. It was loaded to the gills with everything that I'd had in college, my parents, my sister, myself. And the car was waddling along the New York Thruway when a New York State trooper decided he was going to see what was in this car. And he stopped it, and my dad showed him his federal identification, and we were released. That's the only time I ever saw him do it. But as an example of his fidelity to his position, he usually worked with pencil. He would type on a Royal typewriter, and then he would edit in pencil. Well, we had lots of pencils around the house, but there were the federal pencils, and then there were the pencils that we could use. We were not allowed to use the federal pencils. Getting close to the time that he resigned, I got a phone call one day from the local police station saying that the BP gas station has called us, and a gentleman didn't pay for his gasoline at the station. They've traced his license. We've traced the license plate, and we believe it's your dad. I said, okay, I'll come down and pay the bill. So I went to the gas station, and of course I delighted in telling my dad that he had forgotten to pay for his gas. I get a reimbursement check from him, and on the memo it says, for the BP gas I passed. So those are some of my stories about my dad. I'm going to close with one story, and I really have mixed feelings about telling this, but I shared it with somebody today, and they said I should. So what was it that motivated this man? I'll tell you this story that I would not share if my father had not spoken of it publicly in a confession of faith in our church when he was getting on in age. As I mentioned, there were three brothers in my father's family. The oldest was a law student at Ohio State when my dad was, I believe, a junior in high school. My dad never discussed this around the household, and we knew of it only from my mother. And I never heard of him speak publicly until this confession in church. During a hunting expedition at a farm that was owned by a family member, my dad's gun accidentally discharged. His brother took the bullet. Because penicillin was not available at the time, he died of gangrene sometime later. And so my father dedicated himself to living two lives. And I think it's a testament to everything you've heard about him, that he had patience, that he had wisdom, that he understood what wounds were, that he made that dedication. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And now we're graced with Marvin Karp's closing words.
I want to talk to you about one day very late in the life of Judge Thomas. It was June 1st, 1998. But before I do so, I think it's appropriate to correct the historical record with respect to this inn somewhat. Bill Thomas was one of a small group of us who formed this inn around 1991. And one of the things that we determined to organize the inn, we needed a name. And it was Bill Thomas who suggested the original name of this inn, which was the Harold H. Burton Inn of Court. And Bill Thomas suggested that because he said that Harold Burton was the only person from Cleveland who ever became a justice of the United States Supreme Court. When he died, around 2001, Fred Kramer, who was here this evening, suggested, we ought to change the name of the inn to the William K. Thomas Inn. And all of us who heard that from Fred immediately said, what a marvelous idea, and it was done. And that is why this inn has become the William K. Thomas Inn for the past 10 or 11 years. June 1st, 1998 was a day on which the legal community of this community honored William K. Thomas. It was a luncheon at the Marriott Hotel. It came about primarily at the instance of Magistrate Judge Pat Heeman. Pat was a member of this inn, former law clerk of Judge Thomas, and at a small lunch that she and Nora Hurley organized, she said something ought to be done for this man. He's almost 50 years on the bench, and he has never been honored. And we said, you're absolutely right. And we organized this luncheon. We then went to 3 bar associations, the Cleveland Bar, the Cuyahoga County Bar, the Federal Bar, and asked for their help in handling the logistics. We needed mailing lists. We needed somebody to handle the mailing, notification of people, working with the hotel, et cetera. And the 3 bar associations leaped in with great enthusiasm. And accordingly, on June 1st, 1998, more than 400 lawyers and judges assembled in the main ballroom of the Marriott Hotel. Now, when you're honoring somebody, you've got to give them something, and this became a problem with respect to Judge William K. Thomas, a man who would accept nothing. Proclamations, plaques, he had nothing to do with it. He didn't want that, his staff told us. So what do we do? And we scratched our heads about it until members of his staff told us that back in the days when the Indians were having their problems, much like today, and that few people would show up at the old municipal stadium to the games, Judge William K. Thomas, during his lunch hour, would frequently walk down to the stadium, buy a ticket, and sit in the seats for a few innings in order to demonstrate his support for the team. Well, now it was 1998, and we're in a brand new ballpark, and we had a wonderful team, and tickets were suddenly very hard to get. And therefore, what we did, we contacted more than 20 law firms in this community and said, you've all got season tickets. Give us a couple tickets for William K. Thomas. And lo and behold, they did so. And on June 1st, 1998, when we made a presentation to Judge Thomas, what we gave him were a bucket of something like close to 100 baseball tickets to the Cleveland Indians, along with an Indians baseball cap, so everyone know who he was rooting for. Now, the program that we had was very much like we had tonight, because what we did, we had like 6 or 8 people from the bar get up and speak about and tell about their reminiscences of Judge Thomas's. And those people were Charlie Clark, Fred Wiseman, who incidentally was supposed to be here this evening, but became ill today, Mark O'Neill, Jerry Gold, Bill Falsgraf, Judge Pat Heeman, and Judge Thomas's oldest son, John, who came from Sausalito, California for the occasion. And they told stories much like you heard today, from all of which we could distill, if you would, the remarkable qualities of this remarkable man, who everyone felt in this community that there had never been a finer judge, state or federal, a finer judge in northeastern Ohio than William K. Thomas, because he had such extraordinary qualities. He was scholarly. In the middle of a trial, if you cited to him a case, he would stop, recess the trial, and go back to his chambers, find the case, and read it in its entirety. He had an acute power of analysis, the ability to cut through a maze of conflicting evidence. He was unbelievably fair, almost exasperatingly so. I don't know how many times I would sit there and say, why is he listening to this drivel from the other side? And he would listen and take it all in and just be so receptive and fair and thoughtful about what he was hearing. He was creative. He would devise procedures which would enable the participants in the most complex or novel case to achieve an absolutely fair trial. And he was so courteous to lawyers, so lacking in temper or temperament. I think it was Nikki who spoke about this earlier. So lacking in temper or temperament that even the most inexperienced lawyer felt immediately comfortable and at home in this magnificent courtroom. All of these qualities blended together so remarkably that lawyers and litigants invariably left his courtroom with profound admiration and a feeling that they could not have been treated more fairly, regardless of whether they had won or lost. And as a consequence, he made each one of us, who had the privilege of appearing before him, truly proud to be a lawyer. And so it came at the end of this luncheon, the time to ask Judge Thomas to speak. Now, I was functioning as master of ceremonies for this particular program, and I therefore want to simply repeat to you the introduction I made for him. And my introduction was this. I recalled for the audience the scene in the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, the scene at the end of the rape trial, which was the centerpiece of the movie, at which a black man being defended by Atticus Finch, the protagonist in the novel, who demonstrated skillfully that the charge of rape against this black man was utterly spurious. How nevertheless, in rural Alabama, in the old Jim Crow days, all-white, all-male jury went out and very quickly found the defendant guilty. And the defendant was led from the courtroom back to a jail cell. And suddenly there was Atticus Finch alone in the courtroom, and he was standing at the trial table, taking his papers and putting them in his briefcase. High above him, in this segregated courthouse, the African-American community sat, and as one, they stood in silence, except for one person. Atticus Finch's daughter, Scout, 10 years old, was there in a balcony, sitting on the floor, looking through the slats that are farther down below. And the African-American minister looked down at her and said very softly, "Stand up, Scout. Your father is passing." I then turned to the audience and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please stand, because Judge Thomas is passing." Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. See you next month. Welcome back to the William K. Thomas Inn of Court.